Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of our podcast. I'm Alex, and as always, I'm joined by the wonderful Sarah.
Hey, Alex. Hi, everyone. So glad to be here again. Today's topic is something we both find pretty fascinating: how to improve your accent.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because accents are such a huge part of our identity and how we're perceived by others. Whether you're trying to master a new language or just polish your current one, improving your accent can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to say right from the start that there's no such thing as a bad accent. Accents are a natural part of language and culture. But sometimes, depending on where you live or work, you might want to soften or modify your accent to be more easily understood or to fit in better with your surroundings.
Right. And it's also about confidence. Sometimes, having a strong accent can make people feel self-conscious, especially in situations where they feel like they stand out too much. But remember, the goal isn't to completely erase your accent, just to adjust it if you want to, in a way that makes you feel comfortable.
Exactly. So, how do we actually go about improving our accents? Let's break it down into some practical steps and tips that our listeners can start using today.
Sounds good. I think the first thing to consider is listening. Really listening to the way native speakers talk. It's about immersing yourself in the sounds, the rhythm, the intonation. What do you think, Sarah?
I totally agree. Active listening is key. When you listen to native speakers, you start to pick up on the subtle differences in pronunciation that might be missing when you speak. You can do this by listening to podcasts, watching movies, or even just paying attention to people around you.
And while you're listening, try to mimic what you hear. Don't just passively consume the content, actually try to repeat the words and phrases. I've found that mimicking can help a lot with getting the right sounds.
Yes, I think that's one of the best ways to start. And when you mimic, don't be afraid to exaggerate a little. It might feel strange at first, but exaggerating the sounds can help you really grasp the nuances of the accent.
Right, like when you're practicing a difficult sound, exaggerating it can make it easier to produce accurately. And over time, you'll naturally tone it down as it becomes more comfortable for you.
Exactly. Another technique that can be really helpful is recording yourself. This can be a bit daunting because we're often our own harshest critics, but it's super effective. When you play back the recording, you can compare it to native speakers and identify areas where you might need to improve.
Definitely. Recording yourself gives you a different perspective. You might notice things you didn't realize you were doing, like mispronouncing certain words or having a different intonation than you thought.
And it's also great for tracking your progress. You might not notice small improvements day by day, but if you compare a recording from a few months ago to one you make today, you'll likely hear a big difference.
That's a really good point. Progress can be slow, so it's important to recognize the improvements you're making, even if they seem small.
Another aspect to consider is focusing on the specific sounds or patterns that are most different from your native language. For example, if you're learning English and your native language doesn't have certain vowel sounds, it's worth spending extra time on those.
Yeah, and some languages have completely different rhythm and stress patterns. Like, in English, we tend to stress certain syllables in a way that might not happen in other languages. Paying attention to stress and rhythm can make a huge difference in how natural your speech sounds.
Absolutely. And don't forget about intonation, how your voice rises and falls in a sentence. Intonation can change the meaning of a sentence in English, so it's really important to get a feel for it.
That's true. Even if your pronunciation is perfect, if your intonation is off, it can make your speech sound unnatural or even confusing to listeners.
One thing that really helped me was practicing with tongue twisters. They're fun, but they're also great for working on tricky sounds and getting your mouth used to making them.
Oh yeah, tongue twisters are awesome for that. They force you to focus on clarity and precision, which is exactly what you need when you're trying to improve your accent.
And they're a great warm-up exercise before you do any speaking practice. It gets your mouth moving and helps you get into the right mindset.
Speaking of mindset, let's talk about the importance of confidence. I think a lot of people get hung up on their accent because they're worried about making mistakes or being judged.
That's so true. Confidence is key. If you're constantly second-guessing yourself or feeling nervous about your accent, it's going to come through in your speech. But if you approach it with a positive attitude, you're going to improve much faster.
Exactly. It's okay to make mistakes. Everyone does when they're learning something new. The important thing is to keep practicing and not be afraid to put yourself out there.
And remember that most people are really understanding and appreciative when they see you're making an effort to improve. They're not going to judge you for having an accent.
Absolutely. Most people are impressed by anyone who's learning a new language or working on their accent. It shows dedication and a willingness to grow.
Another tip I'd like to add is to find a language partner or a group of friends you can practice with. Speaking with others who are either native speakers or are also working on their accents can be really beneficial.
That's a great idea. It's much easier to stay motivated when you're practicing with others. You can give each other feedback, learn from each other's mistakes, and celebrate each other's progress.
And it's also a good way to get used to different accents and speaking styles. Not everyone speaks the same way, even within the same language. So it's useful to expose yourself to a variety of voices.
That's so true. Plus, it makes the learning process more social and fun, which can help you stay committed in the long run.
For sure. And if you don't have anyone to practice with, try speaking to yourself. It might feel a bit odd at first, but it's actually a great way to practice.
Yeah, I do that sometimes. Like when I'm driving or doing chores, I'll just talk to myself in the language I'm practicing. It helps reinforce what I've learned and keeps my brain engaged.
Exactly. You can practice describing what you're doing, thinking out loud, or even narrating a story. It's all about keeping the language alive in your mind.
That's a really good point. And it also helps with fluency because you're constantly working on forming sentences and expressing your thoughts.
Another thing that can be helpful is working on your listening comprehension alongside your speaking practice. The more you understand, the better you'll be able to mimic the sounds and rhythms you hear.
Definitely. And sometimes it's not just about understanding individual words, but getting the overall flow and melody of the language.
Right. And that ties back to the idea of immersion. The more you surround yourself with the language, the more natural it will feel to speak it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to push yourself out of your comfort zone. Try talking about more complex topics or use more advanced vocabulary. It might be challenging at first, but that's how you grow.
And it's okay to stumble a bit along the way. No one expects perfection, and every mistake is a learning opportunity.
That's so true. And speaking of growth, I think it's important to remind our listeners that improving your accent is a gradual process. It's not going to happen overnight, but with consistent practice, you will see progress.
Absolutely. Patience and persistence are key. Celebrate the small victories along the way and keep pushing forward.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Sarah. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Just that improving your accent is a personal journey, and it's important to set realistic goals and enjoy the process. Don't get discouraged if it takes time. Keep practicing, stay confident, and remember to have fun with it.
Post-episode discussion.
You know, Sarah, I think one of the reasons people find it difficult to work on their accent is because they might not know where to start.
I agree. It can be overwhelming, especially if you're not sure which sounds or patterns you need to work on. That's why I think it's important to start with some kind of self-assessment. Maybe you're recording yourself reading a passage or even just speaking freely about a topic and then comparing it to a native speaker.
That's a great idea. It's like establishing a baseline so you know where you're starting from. And from there, you can identify specific areas to focus on.
Right. And it's also a good idea to prioritize the most common sounds or patterns in the language. For example, in English, mastering the th sound can make a big difference because it's so prevalent.
Exactly. And if you're speaking English, another common challenge is the difference between short and long vowel sounds. It might seem subtle, but it can really affect how easily you're understood.
Yes, like the difference between ship and sheep. They're just one sound apart, but if you get it wrong, it can change the meaning completely.
And that's why practicing minimal pairs, words that are identical except for one sound, can be really useful. It helps train your ear and your mouth to differentiate between those tricky sounds.
Definitely. And another technique that can help is shadowing, where you listen to a native speaker and try to speak along with them as closely as possible, matching their speed, rhythm, and intonation.
Oh, shadowing is great. It's like you're trying to become the speaker, not just repeat what they're saying. It's challenging, but it really forces you to pay attention to all the details of their speech.
Exactly. And even if you can't keep up at first, that's okay. Just keep practicing, and gradually, you'll find that you're able to mimic the speaker more closely.
And it's also a good way to build fluency because you're not just focusing on individual words or sounds. You're working on the overall flow of the language.
That's so true. And the more you practice, the more natural it will feel. It's like any other skill. The more you do it, the better you get.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that everyone's accent is unique, and there's no one right way to speak. It's about finding a balance between maintaining your own identity and making adjustments that help you communicate more effectively.
Exactly. And like we said earlier, it's okay if you never completely lose your accent. The goal is to be understood and to feel confident when you speak.
You know, Sarah, something that just crossed my mind is how improving your accent can sometimes help you understand the culture behind the language better, too. Have you ever noticed that?
Oh, absolutely. Accents carry a lot of cultural nuances. For example, the way someone pronounces certain words can give you clues about their region, their background, and even their personality to some extent. When you start adopting those sounds, it's almost like you're stepping into the shoes of someone from that culture.
That's such a good point. It's like learning a whole new perspective on communication. I think that's one of the reasons why accent work is so interesting. It's not just about the technical side of pronunciation, but about connecting with the culture on a deeper level.
Exactly. It's like when you're learning a new language and you start to pick up on the little things that aren't in the textbooks. The slang, the idioms, the expressions that are unique to that culture. Your accent is part of that puzzle.
Right, and it can even change how you're perceived by others. I remember reading about how sometimes even a slight change in accent can make a difference in how people react to you, especially in professional settings.
Yes, it's interesting how much weight accents carry in social interactions. In some cases, it can open doors, while in others, it might create barriers. That's why I think it's important to be mindful of how we approach accent improvement. It's not just about blending in, but also about staying true to yourself.
Exactly. It's a balance between making yourself understood and maintaining your unique identity. I think that's something a lot of people struggle with, especially when they're in a new country or environment where their accent stands out.
For sure. And I think it's worth noting that while it's great to work on your accent, it's also okay to embrace it. Sometimes our accents are part of what makes us interesting and unique, and they can be a source of pride.
Definitely. And speaking of pride, I think it's important to celebrate the progress you make along the way, even if it's just small steps. Like when you finally nail that tricky sound you've been working on, or when someone compliments you on your pronunciation.
Yes, those little wins are so important. They keep you motivated and remind you that you're moving in the right direction. I think that's something we should all remember. Improving your accent is a journey, and every step forward is worth celebrating.
Absolutely. And along those lines, I think it's also helpful to have a growth mindset. Instead of thinking, I'm bad at this, or I'll never get it right, try to reframe it as, I'm getting better every day, or this is a challenge I can overcome.
That's such a good point, Alex. A positive mindset can make a huge difference. It's easy to get discouraged when you hit a plateau or when things don't click right away. But if you stay positive and keep practicing, you'll eventually break through those barriers.
And speaking of barriers, let's talk about the mental block that some people experience when they're trying to improve their accent. I've noticed that a lot of people, especially adults, feel self-conscious about speaking with an accent, and that can actually hold them back from improving.
Oh, definitely. It's like a fear of embarrassment or of not being understood. That anxiety can make you hesitant to speak up, which in turn limits your opportunities to practice and improve.
Exactly, it's a vicious cycle. But I think the key to breaking that cycle is to push yourself to speak anyway, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. The more you do it, the more natural it will become.
I agree. It's about pushing through that discomfort and realizing that most people aren't judging you as harshly as you might think. In fact, many people are impressed by anyone who's working to improve their language skills.
Totally, and sometimes just acknowledging that you're working on your accent can help ease that anxiety. Like if you're in a conversation and you're struggling with a word, it's okay to say, "I'm still working on my pronunciation, bear with me." Most people will be understanding and supportive.
That's a great tip. It shows that you're aware of your challenges, but also committed to improving. And it can help take the pressure off a bit.
For sure. And it's also a reminder that we're all human. No one speaks perfectly all the time, even in their native language. So it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to ask for help when you need it.
Absolutely. And sometimes those mistakes can actually be a learning opportunity, both for you and for the person you're speaking with. It can lead to interesting discussions about language and culture, and that's always a good thing.
That's so true. Language is such a rich and complex thing, and there's always something new to learn, no matter how fluent you are. And I think that's what makes it so rewarding.
Exactly. And speaking of learning, another technique that can help with accent improvement is to focus on one sound or one area at a time. Instead of trying to change your entire accent all at once, pick one sound that's particularly challenging for you and really work on mastering that.
Yes, I love that approach. It makes the process less overwhelming and allows you to make steady progress. Plus, once you've nailed one sound, it gives you a boost of confidence to tackle the next one.
Definitely. And you can start with the sounds that have the biggest impact on your clarity. For example, if there's a sound that frequently causes misunderstandings, that might be a good one to focus on first.
Right, like the R and L sounds in English, which can be tricky for speakers of some languages. Working on those can really improve how well you're understood.
Exactly. And once you've mastered a few key sounds, you'll likely find that your overall accent has improved significantly, even if you haven't worked on every single sound.
That's a great strategy, Sarah. It's all about setting achievable goals and building on your progress.
Absolutely. And I think another important aspect of accent work is learning to hear the difference between similar sounds. Sometimes our ears aren't trained to pick up on the subtleties of a foreign language, so it can be helpful to practice listening and distinguishing between sounds.
That's a really good point. It's like training your brain to recognize the sounds so you can reproduce them more accurately. And it's something you can practice even when you're not speaking, just by paying attention to the sounds you hear in everyday conversations, music, or media.
Exactly. And if you're really struggling with a particular sound, it can be helpful to isolate it and practice it repeatedly until it feels more natural. You can do this with minimal pairs, as we mentioned earlier, or by finding words and phrases that contain the sound and repeating them until you get comfortable.
And speaking of comfort, I think it's important to mention that the physical aspect of speaking plays a big role in accent work. Sometimes the challenge isn't just about hearing the sound, but about physically producing it, using your tongue, lips, and vocal cords in a way that might be different from what you're used to.
Yes, that's such a good point. Accents are not just about the brain, they're also about the body. Our mouths have muscle memory, and changing your accent can feel like learning a new physical skill.
Exactly. That's why it's important to practice slowly and deliberately at first, really paying attention to how you're forming the sounds. Over time, your muscles will adapt, and it will start to feel more natural.
Yes, and it's okay to exaggerate the movements at first, as we mentioned earlier. It might feel a bit strange, but it can help you get a better sense of the sound and how to produce it.
Definitely. And don't be afraid to use a mirror when you're practicing. Watching yourself as you speak can help you become more aware of what your mouth is doing and make adjustments as needed.
That's a great tip, Alex. It's all about building that awareness and gradually making the changes that will help you improve.
Absolutely. And like we said earlier, it's a journey. It takes time. But with consistent practice and the right mindset, you can make significant progress.
Definitely. And it's worth the effort, not just for the sake of improving your accent, but for the confidence and satisfaction that comes with it.
Couldn't agree more, Sarah. Improving your accent is about enhancing your communication skills and feeling more comfortable in your interactions. And that's something worth striving for.
Absolutely. So, to all our listeners out there, keep practicing, stay positive, and remember that every bit of progress is a step in the right direction. You know, Alex, something else that comes to mind is the idea of embracing your accent as part of your personal identity. I think it's easy to get caught up in wanting to sound perfect or like a native speaker, but there's also something special about the way our accents tell our stories.
That's a beautiful perspective, Sarah. Our accents are like fingerprints, unique to each of us and shaped by our backgrounds, experiences, and the languages we've learned. Rather than seeing them as something to eliminate, we can think of them as something to refine.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of value in having an accent. It can spark curiosity and conversations, and it's a reminder of where we come from. Plus, it can be a sign of multilingualism, which is such a valuable skill in today's world.
Absolutely. Being able to speak multiple languages is a huge asset, and your accent is a part of that skill set. It shows that you've put in the effort to learn a new language and that you're able to communicate across cultures.
Right. And that's something to be proud of. I think sometimes people feel pressure to sound native. But in reality, what's more important is being able to express yourself clearly and confidently, regardless of whether you have an accent.
That's so true. And I think the world is becoming more accepting of different accents. As people become more globally connected, there's more recognition of the fact that accents are a natural part of language diversity.